Hi everyone, welcome to the 6th episode of my video series, PositiviTea. In this series, I interviewed the amazing people of the BIPOC community and I focus on the positive, while they spill all the tea. I started this series as a way to educate myself and others on the injustices that the BIPOC community faces daily, so that I can become a better ally. I want to take action, rather than just reposting a post on my Instagram without actually realizing what I'm posting. In this episode, I interview Zetta Elliott, who is an award-winning Black feminist author and educator. We discuss the differences between living in the US versus Canada. We also discuss all the amazing work that she has published from poetry, essays, and books, and so much more. I hope you enjoy. Okay, so Zetta, welcome to my video series, PositiviTea. So this is where I interview amazing people from the BIPOC community and I focus on the positive while they spill all the tea, meaning they tell me a lot about themselves and what they're working on. So I started this series to educate myself and others about the injustice that the BIPOC community faces daily so that I can become a better ally. And I want to take action rather than just reposting on Instagram without understanding what I'm posting. So today I'll be interviewing Zetta Elliott, who is an award-winning Black feminist author and educator. So welcome to my video series, Zetta.
Thank you, Ava. I'm honored to be here.
And before we jump into things, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your brand?
That's such an interesting question. I don't really think of myself as having a brand, probably because I'm not that active on social media. And if I were, I would know that I need to cultivate and promote my brand. So I am an immigrant. I was born and raised in Canada. I lived there till I was 21. I grew up outside of Toronto, born in Ajax, grew up in Pickering, then moved to Scarborough, went to university in Quebec, Bishop's University. And then my father was living in Brooklyn and he invited me to move to New York City to at least spend the summer with him. And as soon as I got to Brooklyn, I basically fell in love with it. And so I had never lived in a majority Black place. I had always lived in majority white communities and attended majority white schools, attended very good schools in a middle class white community, but never had a Black educator until my last semester of my last year of university. And so once I had a Black educator who was introducing me to Black authors and global politics and post-colonialism, like my head was about to explode. And I felt like I needed to do my university degree over again. And so I came to the US thinking I would go to college and then ended up meeting a professor at York University in Toronto who said, oh no, you don't do another undergrad degree, you go to graduate school. So I ended up going to NYU. I did my PhD there in American Studies, focusing on African-American literature and culture. And I've worked with kids for 30 years. I love working with kids. I love teaching. I was a professor for 10 years, but knew that I needed more time to focus on my writing. And so I quit my last professor job in 2014 and have been writing full-time since then. And I lived in New York for 20 years, but I've hopped around a little. I lived in Louisiana and Massachusetts and Ohio. I left New York in 2018 and went to Pennsylvania for a couple of years because I have family roots there. And I landed here in Evanston last summer. So I'm coming up on 1 year in Evanston and I really like it here. So I think I'm going to stay put for a while. And my swearing in ceremony to become a US citizen is in a couple of weeks. So
Oh, wow,
I will
that's
be dual
amazing.
citizen, Canadian and US. Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah, because so I understand, like you said, that you were born and raised in Canada, but you've lived in the US for the last 20 years. Do you miss Canada at all? And do you see a difference in living in the US versus Canada?
Yeah, that's so interesting. Do I miss Canada? Hmm. Every so often I miss butter tarts. I
Yeah.
miss shreddies. Or I want a really good donut and there's no, well, there are Tim Hortons down here, but it doesn't taste the same. But for the most part, I'm here in the US, I'm living the life I wanted to live. I wanted to be a writer and I am. And I couldn't have had that life had I stayed in Canada. It just wasn't an option for me. So I think, I have most of my family is in Canada still, and some of my longtime friends, and I do miss them a little, but generally I only go up once or twice a year to visit. Um, it is very different living in the United States, and I get a little annoyed by sort of the smug attitude of many Canadians who must think that I'm suffering greatly down here, and how could I not want to be north of the border? And so there's a little bit of tension there. I mean, Canada is an incredibly progressive country, and I feel really privileged and fortunate that I was born and raised there. Um, but Canada is progressive, not perfect. That's what I try to explain to folks down here. In the United States, also not perfect. Absolutely, we have a lot of problems down here, but there are greater risks and greater rewards. And what the African American community has managed to create here against all odds and with a lot of determination and vision, being able to belong to that community and to participate in that sort of storytelling tradition. Um, it's not that there isn't a Black storytelling tradition in Canada, there is. I certainly wasn't introduced to it through the Canadian school curriculum at all. But my grandmother's people were African American, and they came from Philadelphia and went to Ontario. And then, a lot of people during the slave era down here found Canada to be the promised land, and they headed north and thought they were safe and free there. And then at least half of them came back to the United States once the Civil War was over. So I feel like there's always sort of been that back and forth migration across the border. And I wouldn't trade my life here for life in Canada, but I do wish that the United States could learn some things like socialized medicine. Universal healthcare is something that I don't think the US will ever achieve. Canada it's a bigger country geographically, but population wise, much, much smaller. And there are things that Canadians are committed to doing that folks here in the US simply aren't. And I do miss that. Gun violence down here is incredibly demoralizing, and I don't see a solution to that. And it is really difficult to live in a place where access to guns is just so easy. And then there are so many frustrated and angry men who feel like picking up a gun is going to solve a problem. But this is a nation of dreamers, and I'm a dreamer, and I do hope that collectively we can imagine and then work towards creating a safer, more secure, and more just society.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. The whole gun violence issue, it one breaks my heart just seeing all like the violence that comes around it. But at the same time, how is COVID have gotten any better, gotten any worse down in US, or has it kind of been in where you are, sorry?
Right. So, I think where I am, we had maybe three new cases last week. So Evanston is doing really well. But, for the past year, we had a different administration, and that administration was completely incompetent. And so we lost more than 500,000 people. And, it specifically impacted people of color, Indigenous communities, and it just highlighted the disparities that many of us already knew existed. So it was frustrating. And then, we have a new administration, and they have been extremely efficient in getting the vaccine rolled out. And so we're doing quite well. I think we're close to 50% of adults being vaccinated. But we also have a lot of hesitancy. We have people who don't trust the healthcare system because they have been betrayed in the past and not served well. So we still have some challenges, but I got my second dose last week. So I feel, I was really happy to get that. And the city was super organized, and I'm very close to Northwestern University, and I just walked over to the campus and got my shot. And it's strange because I thought, everyone said, have you lost anyone to COVID? And I said, I'm so lucky that almost my entire family is in Canada and they're safe up there. And then to see how hard it has been for Canada to get its act together in terms of rolling out the vaccine and, going under lockdown after lockdown after lockdown. So my mother's in a retirement home. She's well taken care of, but my friends are only just now getting their first dose. And I hear they won't get their second dose until August or something, which doesn't sound ideal, but yeah, there are a lot of disparities in both of our countries that we have to work on.
Yeah, and has it been a good impact on your writing? Like, has it been affected in any way, or your books at all, or no?
Yeah, that's interesting. I always say that crisis activates my imagination. So in 2005, I believe, I moved to Louisiana 2 weeks before Hurricane Katrina hit. And then wham, right? The hurricane hits and people were flooding from New Orleans into Baton Rouge, where I was teaching at Louisiana State University. And I just started writing and sending out as many things as I could and applying for every job and applying to graduate programs. And I just got kicked into high gear. And I think the pandemic did the same thing for me. So I had been traveling a lot and I wanted to slow down. I wanted to stop flying all around the country. And the pandemic made that possible. So all of a sudden, I'm at home. I have the privilege of working remotely. Initially, I wasn't doing that many school visits because everything was canceled. And then everybody discovered Zoom. And so then I got to be overwhelmed by requests to do Zoom conferences and panels and readings and presentations. And it was a lot. So at this point, I am finally getting the right balance, I think, so that I have enough time to write. I self-published 2 books last year, no, 3 books last year, and had 2 books that came out with traditional publishers. And I have 3 books in production right now. And then I have a list as long as my arm of projects I'm trying to finish, hopefully this summer. One of my books, Say Her Name, is a poetry collection, and a theater producer saw it on a list of anti-racist books to read and reached out to me. And now we're trying to get it on stage as a play. And Dragons in a Bag, the first book, was optioned for a film. So we're working on the film treatment. So I have to say, sometimes I feel a little bit guilty because the pandemic really just devastated so many families and communities. And I have been very fortunate. I'm one of those people that just was able to isolate and stay and work at home and stay safe. And so I'm trying to make sure I'm funneling my excess resources towards those folks that need it most, because it's certainly people kept saying, oh, we're all in the same boat when it comes to a pandemic, and we're really not, right? It's hitting different people in different ways. And folks who were already disadvantaged before are even more disadvantaged now. So it's up to folks who are advantaged to make sure we do a little redistribution and even things out.
Right. But that's amazing to hear that some of your books will be coming even on a play or a film. That's so, oh, fingers crossed.
I'll believe it when I see it, but right now, yeah.
So when reading through your about section on your website, I am like amazed with all the amazing work that you have done and that you have published. And you have poetry, essays, young adult books, children's books, and plays, as well as your own book in print called Rosetta Press. Can you tell us about your favorite piece that you have written, if you have one, and what seems to be your reader's favorite?
Yeah, so I always cringe when I hear the F word. It's like asking your parents, who's your favorite child, right? They should not have an answer to that question. And so I have written so many different things. I could not pick a favorite, and I'm still working on so many more projects. So who knows if the next thing I write might be, my masterpiece. So I don't have a favorite piece, but I always remember who and where I was when I was writing something particular. And now that I have close to 40 books for kids and teenagers, I can really look back and sort of see patterns in my work, themes that are clearly recurring. I'm writing more now about mental illness, and I'm, really glad that evolved in my writing, because it's something I've lived with since I was a teenager, and there really wasn't any conversation within my family about it or in the books that I was reading. Right now, I would say probably Dragons in a Bag is the top selling book, definitely among, younger kids. It's for probably 6 to 10-year-olds, and I think we're at about 125,000 copies sold. And that will probably continue if there's a film and it's been selected as the global read aloud for the fall. And so hopefully more kids around the world will be reading it. Maybe we can get it into some different languages even. So that book is probably the best known. Favorites would really depend on the reader, I think. I have some sort of hardcore old time fans who still love Bird, my very first picture book. That's just their favorite. And they do read my other books, but I think that number one, that first book is their favorite. Folks who love Octavia Butler and like time travel stories really love A Wish After Midnight. And then I have to say a lot of the books that I have self-published, and I've had to self-publish most of my books, people don't even know about. So if they actually knew how many of the books were out there and the stories, there might be some new favorites.
Oh, that's awesome. And also on your website as well, there's also the section Why I Write. And so can you tell us a bit about this? Why do you write?
Yeah, I think when I was a kid, storytelling made me feel powerful. I had sort of a couple of years in my life when I was around 6 or 7, my older brother, who was adopted, was sent back to his birth family, and my parents got divorced, and then we moved into a community, and I was put in a school where I wasn't put in the gifted and talented program, even though I had skipped a grade, and there were just a lot of things happening in my life that I had no control over. But when I was telling stories in the schoolyard, it was a good way to make friends and to have an audience and to just feel like I was in control for a minute or two. And then I had a teacher, Nancy Vickert, in high school who took me aside and said, if you want to be a writer, you will be. And I didn't know that you just had to decide. But, once I did decide and started writing outside of school, then I realized, there were things that I could say in a space where I wasn't going to be graded and I wasn't, trying to impress anybody. I was journaling. Writing really was therapeutic. I had depression and anxiety in high school, but didn't know that it was depression and anxiety. So I was reading a lot, and then I would try writing, patterning myself after the people that I was reading, which was mostly Charles Dickens in high school. But by the time I discovered Black women writers in university with my first Black educator, I knew that I wanted to be part of that tradition. And then to read so many Black women writers and storytellers, and to know that we had been encountering sort of similar issues, even though we were spread out all around the world. Once you feel like you're part of a chorus, then your voice has more strength. It isn't just you out there, sort of singing alone with a timid, shy voice. Then all of a sudden you're part of a much louder and fuller chorus. And once I understood that, then I knew I wanted to tell particular kinds of stories. And I understood that my own experiences were worth being in a book. And if you've only read stories about white people, you can start to feel like your stories don't matter. And the first book for kids that I wrote featured white children, because I didn't know that magical stories happen to everybody. But once I discovered Octavia Butler, Black woman science fiction writer and fantasy writer, then all the doors started to open. And because I have worked with kids for so long, I knew that I wanted to make sure they didn't have the same experience I had had as a kid, where I never got to see myself in books really. And those books weren't being taught in school, or the books that were being taught in school had racist content, and then I had to navigate that. So I started creating content for the kids that I was working with. And it was a struggle to get it published, but once I learned how to self-publish, then I knew I could continue to serve my community without outsider approval or interference. And that was really empowering too. And then I could teach kids not just how to read books critically, but how to create them.
Wow. And so you mentioned how you've taught at a number of universities around the US. Are you still teaching? And if so, do you teach anything specifically? And what has teaching taught you in general?
Yeah, I am no longer a professor, but I do teach online poetry workshops now, especially since the pandemic. There's been a lot of demand for poetry. And I teach adults, I teach teachers, I teach future librarians, teenagers and kids. I've done a couple of family writing events, which are really fun. Uh, I sort of miss, I don't miss grading. So I do miss sort of teaching at the college level, like when everything was happening last year around the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. I really did wish I had like a place I could go to twice a week for an hour and a half and just talk to a room full of students, because I find I'm a better teacher when I'm writing and I'm a better writer when I'm teaching. Um, and so sometimes I feel like I'm sort of struggling to come up with new activities, because everybody wants the dragon talk, and I could do the dragon talk with my eyes closed at this point. So having the opportunity to design courses, I sort of miss that a little. But at the same time, I'm dealing with so many more people that it's difficult to commit to a 16-week semester with one class of students when I have all these hundreds and thousands of kids that want a bit of my time and attention. So I think I'm still working on finding the right balance between teaching and writing.
Right. And you've mentioned about, so like as I said, I'm trying to learn more about the how to become an ally in the BIPOC community. So do you have any advice for me and others who are trying to do their part to support the work that you have been doing? Is there any advice you could give us?
Well, there needs to be a lot of work done in Canada. So I'm very glad that you're interested in being an ally. Down here, I have a lot of graphics and charts and statistics that I can always point to when I'm discussing racial disparities in publishing, and specifically anti-Blackness in publishing. But that doesn't exist in Canada, and it should. And so the Toronto Star recently published some of its results, but it made it seem as though everything was fine. And I think it suggested that there were quite a few. I think it was 50 or 51 books that were published in 2019, I think, that had a Black main character. And if there are only around 400 books published in Canada for kids every year, then you would think 50 books, hey, that's pretty good. That's a lot better than, the comparable statistics in the US. But only 2 of those books were by Black authors. Two. So 2 out of 419. I mean, that's absolutely absurd. It's appalling, and something needs to be done about it, in part because that's damaging to kids, all kids. They need to see what Black kidlit creators have to say for themselves and how they're able to tell their stories in their own way. But it's also a problem because I believe a lot of Canadian publishers are subsidized. They get government grants, which is to say that's taxpayer money. So taxpayers, how do you feel about the fact that only 2 of the kidlit creators in 2019 were Black people? So I feel as though what's happening in Canada has been happening for decades, is this feeling that, it's somehow rude to talk about race. And so therefore, we're not going to talk about racism. We're going to keep trotting out this narrative around multiculturalism and how we're a tossed salad compared to the melting pot of the United States. But nobody really talks about what's happening in the curriculum, and how can we say, well, you should be teaching more Black Canadian authors in the curriculum if Black Canadian authors aren't even getting published, right? So you have to start looking at the structural issues. Who's working in publishing? I bet I can tell you, straight, white, cisgender women who don't have disabilities. Why is it that one group is being allowed to dominate the publishing industry, which then determines which books are available to be taught to children all across Canada, right? That just doesn't make sense. So who gets to decide what's being taught in Canadian classrooms? Who gets to decide what's in Canadian bookstores? Who gets to decide what books are reviewed? I don't know if I've ever had a book reviewed in a major Canadian newspaper. Like I only came on the radar in Canada, I think like maybe 3 years ago, and I've been writing for most of my life. So if it was just happening to me, then I would say, okay, they just don't like me. But it's not just me. It's happening to Black writers all across Canada, and that needs to change. So I think if young people, we see with the environmental movement how so many young people are driving change to address the climate crisis. And I think young people can do the same, whether it's around gun violence or whether it's around something like equity and inclusion in school curricula, because you actually don't get a say in what gets taught, and that should change. So having teen advisory councils at every library, at every school, being able to participate in the curriculum. I know you're at an alternative school, which is fantastic. But every school in Ontario should have alternatives to what it's been doing, because I don't think a whole lot has changed from the time that I was a student 30 years ago.
Yeah, for me as a student, the only day that Black people or BIPOC community was celebrated was either on like Black History Month and those kinds of days, where I had probably one teacher in grade 7 who spent the whole year improvising, including Black authors, Black American authors, like throughout our course in my grade 7 English class. And that was probably the only teacher I had in my whole like span at high school that really included all those people. So and even when talking with my friends, like half of my friends who have read books or are reading, it's not just the straight white men, women who they're reading. It's a diverse group of different authors of not just one background. And you find that outside of school, because with school, we're just focused on Shakespeare. So, yeah, which there's a lot more to the book or community than Shakespeare, who is a guy who's no longer in this world, where you can.
Because teachers will say, well, I would love to teach, Black history, but I wasn't there, and I'm not Black, and I don't know what to do. It's like, well, you're not British. You weren't living in Elizabethan England, and yet you're teaching Shakespeare every year. So yeah, when I was in high school, we went, you had to read a Shakespeare play every year. You went to Stratford every year. And then we were reading US literature. We read Catcher in the Rye and A Streetcar Named Desire. And, we were reading anything but Canadian lit. I never read any Indigenous lit. I never read any Black Canadian authors. I mean, it's unbelievable. And to know that that hasn't changed is really, really frustrating. So I know my friend, Natasha Henry, has done really important work around creating curricular materials so that you can teach Black Canadian history, because that's what makes you qualified. You study it, you do the same kind of research you would do if you were trying to teach, biology or some other subject, and then you go into the classroom and you share it with your students. And it's okay to say that I'm new to this. What can we discover together? What would you like to learn about? What are the ways we could learn together? This idea that the teacher is just supposed to walk in and be the expert on everything. That's not how teaching has to happen. There are lots of different ways and so many different digital resources now. So there's really no excuse to not have a more inclusive classroom.
Yeah, exactly. And like even with my sister, because like I thought there'd at least be like a change for my sister to at least have some diverse group, but no. And it's like that's why so many people in my grade are not a fan of our English classes, because it's the same thing every year. There's no change. And so, but yeah, no, I found all like my favorite authors all on my own, not through a class in school.
Wow, good for you. I'm glad you have a curious mind.
Yeah, no, and I've tried to encourage like my friends or whatever, but the class in school kind of ruined reading for them as well. Like, and it makes me sad because I've always loved reading. It's my way of like getting me tired to go to bed or like coping with my stress in another way. So, but it just makes me sad that like it's becoming something that's less and less popular with my generation.
It's a struggle. It's a struggle, especially when you see the increasing diversity in film and television. So if you have the option of turning on, Netflix and watching something that centers teenagers of color or centers LGBTQ youth or includes people with disabilities, once you've had that sort of feast for your eyes and senses, it would be really hard to go back and say, oh, now we're going to read Dickens, really? Like there are just a lot of expectations, I think, that need to be adjusted, because Hollywood, it's slow, but it's gradually happening. And the school curriculum needs to catch up.
Yes, it does. And so, well, those are all the questions I have for you. So, but if people would like to learn more about you and what you do, where can they find you?
So I am not on social media all that much, but I have an account at Twitter and Instagram. It's at Zetta Elliott. I have an author page on Facebook, author Zetta Elliott, and my website is pretty much the best place to find out about my books. That's zettaelliott.com.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to come in and talk with me. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for being interested in what allyship really looks like and for giving the mic to members of the BIPOC community. That's fantastic. And I wish you all the best for creating change in Canada.
Well, thank you.